Thank you very much indeed for coming along to the Libertarian Alliance meeting. Today we have a talk by Bob Layson on the crisis. Does the crisis show that Marx or Keynes has been vindicated? And with that I'll hand it over to Bob.
Verdict first, evidence afterwards. So, verdict, no, they've not been vindicated. But let's begin with the crisis. Or rather, let's begin with what followed immediately upon the crisis, which was the supposed revival of Marxist analysis and Keynesian analysis. This is a kind of post-Christmas carol. Maynard was dead to begin with. There can be no doubt whatever about that. But then, of course, he'd never really gone away. Although, of course, in the schools they taught Keynes's work. Sort of, people had to be aware of it. But the major professionals had felt they'd moved on beyond that. It was either a special case of a more general model. Despite him, Keynes calling it the general theory, it was in fact a particular instance of what could happen with sticky prices or sticky wages. Cunning. Well, with sticky prices or sticky wages. He didn't think that. He thought, Keynes thought he had shown that even if the worker was prepared to work for less and less, this would in itself be frustrated by price movements or the fact that the purchasing power of the worker's wage would decline along with, and therefore demand along with it. Therefore, you couldn't get integration back again. You couldn't get full employment back again. That's what he thought he'd shown, though he had in reserve always the idea of sticky prices, which of course no one would have denied that if people price themselves out of jobs they will be. I mean, any economy is worth its salt before Keynes knew that. Edwin Cannon said this quite plainly. For people are simply being paid not to work. It's thought to be a bit heartless at the time, but that was his view of the matter. Anyway, the efficient markets chaps and the monetarists thought that they had taken what was good in Keynes, it wasn't very much, and they moved on beyond. And then the terrible shock, 2008, the turning point, the bursting of the bubble, it didn't quite burst. It started to deflate, and it deflated very rapidly. So in 2007, American house prices started to dip, defaults started to rise on subprime. The bubble was mostly an asset bubble, and a great deal of that was property and housing, or land and housing. And once it was realised that these loans would not be coming back, the banks got themselves into a terrible state. And then people who feared that they might have got themselves into a terrible state, and it wasn't clear whether they had or not, decided to get their money out, or it was feared that they might get their money out, and you know what happened a year later. So it was a little bit to start, like the crumbling of a dam, a bit here, a bit there, a little crack here, and then whoosh. Now, was this, to go to Marx, was this an example of what Marx had predicted? Well, not really. It's not clear that Marx had any single explanation. Some claim he had 2, 3, 4, 5 explanations of business cycles. Some a bit insufficiently high-powered and deep thought, which is that the workers is being robbed and they can't afford to buy the stuff back. That was part of it. He had that in there somewhere, but he mostly relied upon the idea that because of his the proportion between value extracted from living labour and how much that was as a proportion of costs to a firm that has more and more non-human capital, that the ratio between the two would shift such that profit or interest must decline over time. I don't think it's true, but it isn't true. It doesn't. But that was his view. That was one of his explanations for business cycles. So Marx we can ditch straight away. Also, he's not really been claimed to have been vindicated. Sales of Das Kapital and the rest of the stuff has done quite well, I imagine. And those who have ceased being Marxists have remained Marxists and ceased to remain Marxists and remain Marxists. But there aren't that many of those. And even the Marxists, mostly in academia, have not argued for socialism as a solution to the problem. They may argue for sorts of things, mostly just standard deficit finance and deficit spending. But there's nothing particularly Marxist about that. Keynes, however, has far more bounced back, we may say. Robert Skidelsky, yes, man of Warwick University, as are we, not at the same time. He's been churning this stuff out for years. A three-volume biography of the great man. I read it. It's all a bit of a blur. It took some time to get through. No, it's well written, actually. It's long, it is 3 volumes. But that's back in, well, they've never been out of print. Now he's selling more of it. He wrote a book entitled The Return of the Master, which, as far as Skidelsky was concerned, is a resurgence of the royalties, because all of his work writing started to do rather well. But what have they really said? What has really been got from Keynes to explain all this? I would say nothing at all. I mean, the same things can be said as was said before, but those who thought they weren't applicable except as a special case still think that, and those who thought they weren't applicable at all, or rather were telling us what we already knew in a slightly more difficult to understand analysis, always could explain a boom and a bust and a recession. I find it astounding that in many introductions or encyclopedias of economics, dictionaries of economics, it's said that in the 1930s, the classical economists, the stuffy old ones who were about to be elbowed aside by the great Keynesian revolution and all the young Turks came rushing through, that they simply could not explain the recession. Yes. I thought it was the easiest thing to explain in the world. What you couldn't do was tell a politician an easy way out of it. You got us into this, mate. You and your tariffs, you and your labour legislation, you and your making it difficult to hire people, making it difficult to fire people. There wasn't so much then, but that was part of it. And also paying people to sit tight wherever they are and wait for good times to revive. Now that was the most important element of maintaining a depression, especially a depression brought about, as the Austrian school would say, because there has been a malformation of the capital structure due to the cheapening of credit. Not simply the cheapening of credit, because if credit is cheap, people will want it, and that will drive the price up again. So you cheapen credit through a great tidal wave stream of money creation or credit creation. It can be done either way. And so, given all this apparent extra money, extra saving, you've probably heard this before, we have all sorts of long-lived projects now seem more viable than they were before, are attempted. However, the effect of all this money coming through the system is eventually that prices which were anticipated are now higher than anticipated. That seems all right for a while because selling prices or property prices or the selling price for office space seems to be doing rather nicely, thank you, and the costs are rising a bit, the selling price is going up quite well. And then eventually comes a day when the bubble bursts or the penny drops, the stock market starts to weaken, there's some thought of default, some banks being overextended, and then the whole thing collapses. Now that was utterly explicable, and the consequences of the welfare state plus all sorts of people being in the wrong place is also utterly explicable. And given that they're paid to remain where they are and wait for a revival, it's also easy to explain the prolonged nature of the depression. So what was Keynes good for? If it was all very explicable. Well, what it was good for was a way to get out of it, possibly, which could work until you kept telling the public how it was working. We're working this by fooling you. We've got that. We're going to keep putting up prices to water down your wages. You, at the back there, got that? Right. Well, of course, eventually, even the unions tweak this and want for an escalated clauses or catch up or even more than catch
Cost
up.
of living rise.
Cost of living rise. I remember in the 80s and 70s, just to make sure, because you did it once a year perhaps, you've got a good thumping 25% more than was enough to catch up, because you might fall behind for the remainder of the year. So it all got rather silly. Though that wasn't the cause of inflation. The cause of inflation is always and everywhere, well, pretty much always and everywhere, an increase in the money supply. And the government was rapidly increasing the money supply in the 70s and 80s, partly because they'd been too influenced by Keynes. So what was Keynes good for? He was good for telling governments that the only way out of the crisis was to do what they rather like doing anyway, which is to borrow, tax, and spend. And so they did this all the more. And for a while the public are being not yet wised up, it can lower real wages, and people can be absorbed back into work. I mean, sometimes they have to move. I mean, the thing with the crisis is, even the firms that weren't doing, in a sense, doing anything wrong, they're turning out good stuff at good prices, given an overall level of prosperity. But when the parts that have to collapse, overall earnings fall. So even those that were just selling bread or water or whatever it might be, surely they're going to do as well as you. Yeah, but then people go to inferior bread or inferior bottled water. And so other ones who you would have thought would ride safely on, they suffer a little and contract a little. And then when you throw in the fear factor, so those who are actually not likely to lose their jobs fear they might, so they boost their savings, they pull back on a new car or a new fridge or whatever it is, that then feeds in. And it took no Maynard Keynes to tell us this would be a consequence. If you don't want that kind of response to a bust, don't have the boom. One could have said, and some did. I should say, as regards the crisis, that in Victorian literature, and indeed I believe in the dictionary, a crisis is a brief period, climacteric. The heroine is reclining on a sofa, dying of consumption or whatever it might be, and is she gone? Will she last the night?
Touch and go.
Touch and go. Then she turns, starts getting steadily better. So the crisis is short. You cannot have a 5-year crisis. It may be called that, but it isn't. I mean, something is being maintained. It's being reproduced each time. So, babies are coming along, stuff's being made. So where's the crisis? Well, the crisis is that some people are in the wrong place or have learnt the wrong skill and are being slowly, if at all, absorbed into the parts of the economy still doing okay. A great many other government policies, of course, make it very difficult or not worth adjusting, moving from one place to another. All sorts of controls, all sorts of licensing, all sorts of requirements for qualified labour, the difficulty of just running up new houses somewhere and building a new factory somewhere. All of this makes it rather difficult. So, we have the bubble and the bust. Marx is not much use. Keynes, well, we'll come back to Keynes. I would like now to demystify the market for you. Far too much attention is paid to money, otherwise known as demand. It's thought that if you just print the bloody stuff, money that is, demand will increase. And this will boost production. Now, Jean-Baptiste Say, and others before him, because it's a fairly obvious thing, have realised that so far from it being the case that, as Keynes put it, partly to mislead everybody or make it look ludicrous, Keynes has summed up Say's law as supply creates its own demand. So if you produce enough apples, they'll all sell. Or all the wages and incomes that arise from the production of apples will go to buy the apples. Well, that seems a bit strange, because why would apple producers buy them off themselves? But still, he thought that was Well, I think he was just trying to rubbish the idea, and he succeeded admirably, because if you look in most dictionaries or encyclopedias of economics, you'll find that, yes, it's the same old supply creates its own demand. Whereas what Say said, though he said it in French, was produce is used to demand other produce. There is nothing else but transferable, exchangeable produce with which to demand other alienable, as it says in the legal textbooks, means it's owned and it can be transferred. At least the right to it can be transferred. You don't transfer acres of land necessarily, but the ownership can transfer. So that's how the things can be alienated, because they are transferable. They're not like soap bubbles. Services are a bit different. You exchange services. One can do a service and then have a service in return, but they're not quite the hard stuff you can store and buy and sell. But the same thing applies to them. That the only source of demand is produce. Produce already made, already there to hand. It might be your human capital that counts as the product, which means it's your services can be provided. It might be land. It might be stuff already made. It's also, to be fair to him, it's also money. But money is not something magical here. Money doesn't have mysterious powers that other things lack. It isn't money that can vitalise an economy. Money is not the vital spark. Money is simply, as they say in the textbooks, a store of value. It's also two other things, but we didn't bother with them. But everything valuable is a store of value while it lasts. Many things deteriorate in value. Some antique furniture does not. Some buildings do not. Saints' relics generally go up in price towards the Reformation. So there's nothing special about money except that it is the medium of exchange. That is vitally important. But the idea that the value of money somehow is independent of the output of other things is not sufficiently understood. The same amount of money, one can have a perfectly fixed supply of money. It will do no harm. There may be some bother later as coins become tinier and tinier, because if there is invention in an investment and growth, even a population growth, there's no harm at all. It will be the case that productivity per head will increase. You can turn out stuff faster than you can turn out people, is the way I like to put it. And the only thing you can use to hire people to do things is non-people stuff. Well, that's good, because that's the stuff you can turn out a lot more of, pretty much, except Rembrandts and other things. Therefore, that's why wages go up. It's as simple as that. That the stuff you have to exchange for labour services are non-labour services. They're things that can be reduced pretty much in ever greater numbers per head. So there we are. That's increased demand per person because there's increased productivity per person. Not because you've got more money each. In fact, you may even have less money each. In fact, you will have less money each, as merely nominally, so many units of this or that. But your purchasing power, because productivity has gone up per head, has also increased per head. And what is purchasing power? That is the wherewithal to demand other things. So I'd like to demystify economics by simply seeing it as production and exchange. And what to exchange? Other produce. It's very rare you exchange identical things. I mean, there would be no point in it, you would have thought. Unless there was some special attachment whereby it was touched by a saint, or it was the property of Charles Dickens, or something of that kind. Sometimes things that have the same physical properties have a history or an association such that they're valued more or valued less. So if it was Elvis Presley's underpants, which I believe went up for sale fairly recently, they might sell for more. I don't know. But so my point is that demand comes from production. but not the production of money. However, from what is the business views, one might get to think something very different. Governments and banks are thought to be the source of stimulation. I've pointed out before, simply because something is called stimulation, why should we suppose it stimulates? You have to provide a theory to back this up. If you have a mangy old mutt rover, it doesn't stop your hound being a complete dog if you call it stimulus, does it? So the name is one thing and the thing is the other. And most of this is a complete dog. I've said before that the only way in which mere money creation can stimulate an economy is by reducing excessive prices. It might be of land or property or office space or, most importantly, labour. But that's the only way it can do it, and it generally won't do it, especially if the public gets the government of the day to introduce price control. So you're trying to boost demand to stimulate the economy by increasing purchasing power, but then, of course, then there has to be price and wage control to stop purchasing power increasing. They think, I pointed out, the purchasing power is actually the production of stuff and not the increase in money. Simply to increase the money raises prices, generally speaking. It may start here, so those who initially get the money can buy more, especially if they give more of it, as with government departments or providers of infrastructure, magic word, infrastructure. It underpins, apparently. Even if it costs you, it arrives 10 years later and is never used very much. It underpins the economy and mostly puts to work people who are already in work. That's what you do, pretty much. They're your team. That's your contract. You won't go hiring people from the wrong part of the country without the skills you require. So that's why I attempt to demystify the market order by simply pointing out its production and exchange of produce. And that's that. Now, money is part of the thing, is one of the products, a very important product, for reasons that Marx, Keynes, I think in some way half appreciated it, especially as he was a chum of Hayek, so he should have got the point that there has to be a market order for efficient calculation of or selection between production methods, between production plans. It's not enough to simply know that one plan uses less wood, or another plan uses less metal, or another plan uses less concrete, or more labour, or less labour, without knowing whether that's a good or a bad thing. Obviously, if all plans are identical except that one uses slightly more of something, and all use equal amounts of the remainder, then we can pick the better plan. It's the one that uses less. That we can do. But ordinary, or almost every business plan or production plan cannot be like that. There's simply so many substitutes, more skilled labour, less skilled labour, more machinery, building it here, building it there, moving the stuff afterwards, or being nearer your customer. There are so many ways of delivering that there has to be a way of costing a plan. And it so happens that if you engage in monetary calculation, the price alone cannot do it. The prices have to be entered into a plan. These are the costs, these are the expected sales, these are the unit costs, these are the unit returns. This plan is better than that plan. And what you really want to do is to have the less real costly or the most really beneficial plan. But the only way we can do it is by doing it through money. It looks like people are valuing money, or are only concerned about the money, or they think that money shows the value of everything. No. Valuations change money prices, and money prices reveal valuations and are useful for that purpose. Rather like following a compass, keeping a compass heading on a ship, for example. It enables you to follow a track that is actually invisible. You cannot see the track you wish to follow. Say you simply wish to follow the equator. You cannot see it. You cannot simply drive like down the middle of a road, keep to it. But something visible enables you to track something invisible. In the same way with money prices and economic calculation, it doesn't reveal to you the best plan, but it does allow you to see the better plan. Oh, of course, it's presumed something about the customer liking your rubbishy product or other prices not being lower than your own, even if your product is as good as theirs. These things are not always possible to get right, but it does allow you to say at the outset, if these are the prices we have now, and those are the expected prices, that plan is a non-starter, that one might work, and this one seems to be the one to go for. And then the process of competition means that it's going to become clear which plans worked and which plans didn't work. So Marx did not see the sense in this. Keynes did see the point in the social process of selecting superior plans, formulating, discovering. It's almost a bit like a Popperian conjecture and refutation, that you attempt an ensemble of assets, a method of working with them, and then it's put to the test. It can't give you the most efficient, it cannot give you perfect markets, not as I view it, but it can, and it is the only way in an advanced industrialised society with specialised production, which is then used to exchange for a multi-purpose good, well, single-purpose good really, money, which is then used to exchange for different specialist produce. In an advanced economy, most specialist producers, say they're making pencils, to use a famous example, they're going to rely on things that aren't pencils to make it. And there's great many things they don't even know what they are, but they're going to rely upon them. And those specialists in turn that make the parts that go to make the pencil, or the machinery, they themselves are going to rely on other specialists. And the only way in which the whole configuration can be coordinated is through the price system and through monetary calculation by producers. Now, Marx didn't see that. Keynes did see that if you could get the aggregate demand problem solved, I'll come on to the aggregate demand idea, then you could rely upon competition between producers to work out better ways of doing it, to weed out the inefficient ways of doing it. But it was vitally important to maintain aggregate general demand, because without that, there could be a slump, or there could be less than the activity there might be. Now, what was wrong with Say's law and Keynes' view, and people other than Keynes? Well, he thought that there was a hiatus between more than one pair of parties, between the saver might save, which is a good thing, except he very often speaks as though it isn't. But what he meant was investing is a good thing, and where does the money come from? So saving's fine as long as investors pick it up and use it. Otherwise, it just lies there. And because it just lies there, then demand falls, because assets are not being purchased, people are not being employed, and incomes are lower than they would have been. And the thing feeds on itself in a terrible downward spiral. And we end up in, you know where. Keynes never explains why this spiral doesn't carry on all the way down. It should, after all. One man's layoff is a loss of earnings. Loss of earnings is a loss of expenditure. Loss of expenditure is a loss of sales. So the whole thing ought to collapse down to nothing. Especially in a laissez-faire system. Under a system whereby, as Milton Friedman put it, there are automatic stabilisers. In other words, people are paid a dole, so at least they can spend that. I think it's the other way around. I think it automatically stabilises the economy down there when it should have been up there. Because instead of shuffling off to find work that would actually pay for itself, would actually be profitable, and at a much higher rate than, or considerably higher rate than they're getting on the dole, they remain upon the dole. But they're turning out no produce. They're pleasing their superiors, they're turning up at labour exchanges, they're saying, what a godsend this is, I'd starve without it, all the things that politicians like to be told. I mean, they're handy for that reason, but they're not turning out a marketable product, which constitutes, as Say would say, demand, true demand. Now that's one hiatus between saving and investing. But if you're going to take that line, there's also a hiatus between making something and selling it. In other words, how can you be sure, he said, that savings will be borrowed? Well, you can't always. It depends on what government policies are to dissuade people from doing it or frighten people. If there is sufficient regime uncertainty, as there now is in this country in America, as to what's going to be hitting a company in the way of costs or medical provisions that have to be made or new schemes, then in those circumstances you might prefer to just sit and wait. And it doesn't help that you sit and wait, but the only thing that really freezes the system is government intervention. The other hiatus, which no one notices, is that, well, you might make something that no one wants. That can happen, can't it? That's true, it can happen. Happens a lot. All right. So you might save more than people bother to borrow. Okay. So what? Keynes has this idea that there's a certain volume of spending, or there is a certain level of interest rate, such that if the interest rate is too high, or the volume of spending is too low, then we can be stuck in a permanent recession. Because my view is that the money is always enough. It would help if it wasn't rapidly declined to nothing, but it's not likely to do that. It's certainly not with commodity money, which I advocate. So there's no reason to worry about, there's every reason to worry about selling something that happens to be duff, but it's impossible for everybody to be inferior to his competitor. So certain firms are always going to be profitable, simply because of the other ones who aren't selling such a good product, especially those who deal in necessities. Now, this is the reason why you cannot have a downward spiral to nothing, because people, one way or the other, they're going to have the necessities. Now, they either go and get a job at a lower rate, which will be the better way of doing it. I'm not blaming the worker, by the way, here. I'm explaining how workers come to be paid to do nothing. If they weren't paid to do nothing, we'd find things to do. It might mean busting the union wage rate. It might mean moving. And undoubtedly, in a modern economy, I feel very sorry for the youth unemployed in Europe at this point. It's been made almost impossible to profitably employ these people. It's not their fault. During the 1930s, there was never a problem of boys and girls being unemployed. I mean, teenagers being unemployed. They weren't paid much. They might be in apprenticeships that pay very little. Some apprenticeships, while you were learning a trade, the parents actually paid the company. That did happen. Not very much, but because the boy was learning a trade, it was like paying for someone to be at school. Why wouldn't you pay? Or why wouldn't it be very low wage? And it was a very low wage, but there was no problem about full employment for teenagers. They were fully employed because they were left out of the union agreements and they got no dole money, they got no benefit. They were living with their parents and they were too young. And they hadn't paid their stamp, as some of us might remember it being called.
Lecturers as well, high academies worked for nothing for the first few years.
Yes.
And that was the norm. Robbins also worked for a year without paying.
So, yes, Keynes also thought the interest rate could be a problem, not simply the amount of money flooding in or the amount of borrowing. He also thought the interest rates could be too high. Just a natural, emergent interest rate could be too high. And this just puzzled me. I mean, you have an interest rate because you have not an amount of money, because whatever the amount is, once it's there, it's the amount of money, and there'll be nominal prices may be this or this. There's no reason why once the money has stopped flooding through, once it's pretty steady, and it would be with the commodity money, that there will be an interest rate. Now, what will the interest rate depend upon? Ordinarily, upon the minds of the population. What sort of population have we got? Is it the sort that likes to save? Is it a sort that will save if there's a decent rate in it? Now, I don't deal with general equilibriums. I don't care for that form of analysis. But there will be cases when a new invention has come along, a new country has been discovered. So there are sudden opportunities to do well with certain types of capital. Not all capital makes equal return. Sometimes, if you're the first with a new idea, or at least first to develop it commercially, you will undercut your competitors. You will make it better, or you will sell it far cheaper. So they have to move fast too. So they're prepared to bid up the interest rate to stop other projects going forward that would not be so profitable, and for theirs to succeed. Hayek called this the interest rate brake effect, and it's no bad thing. It stops certain projects going on. Doesn't mean that there can't be full employment, but there will be a redundancy and a movement of workers, relocation of workers. So I think of the interest rate emerging from the mentality of the population. Of course, it's not uniform, but there will end up being a rate that goes with it, because some are always going to save anyway. Doesn't matter hardly what the interest rate was. They like to think they'll save. Some will hardly save anything, and others will save a bit more or a bit less, depending where the market interest rate has come to. But the idea that an interest rate will go with a certain level of unemployment seems to be like saying, if I wear the wrong socks, my hat won't fit. It's the two things are quite distinct. To get yourself into a job means you simply have to be of use and not asking for more than you're worth, and the producer has to be making things that people want and not too high a price. But there's a reason why the interest rate may go with a certain level of saving, and a certain level of saving may go with a certain level of increased production. If it's too small, per capita output might decline. If people aren't saving enough, that can happen. Or if there's some natural disaster and you don't save enough in response, then for a while, average incomes will be lower. But everyone can be employed at that interest rate. I see no reason to suppose it won't fit. It's like having the wrong language. Well, if you all understand each other, we can make plans, and the different language does not mean a different level of output. And I think the same goes with, I'm sure the same goes with a naturally formed interest rate. That emerges from free banking. So the government is not involved in providing the money supply, doesn't have a view on what the money ought to be. If you must have a minimal state, the government will simply notice what the people are using as money. Well, that's what we'll tax you in. That's what we'll ask. Yes, not very much, but we'll ask for that stuff. I don't know where you're getting it from. I was being dug out of the ground. I say, well, fine. That's how you want to do it. That's what we'll do. It's not for us to tell you what money to have, after all. So once you have that and an interest rate that emerges from it, there's no reason why there cannot be full employment. Of course, there's always going to be, since I'm not a believer in general equilibrium, because it doesn't happen, generally, there'll be firms doing well, firms doing badly, mistakes made, declining industries. They're not declining to nothing, some do. Manufacture of 78 wind-up gramophones is probably now gone. But other ones, like coaches for horses, are still being produced, but very few of them compared to the past. So there will be declining industries, there will be redundancy. There's always going to be redundancy in an economy that is not, and because it cannot be running at general equilibrium with all profits equal for all investments. No need to move. No, there's no profit to be gained from moving anybody from here to there. There's Pareto optimality, as it's called. In other words, to move someone from here to there, or an asset to be used by this firm instead of that firm, will reduce output overall. So I simply reject Keynes' idea that an interest rate can spoil the thing. It's a bit like someone complaining about the country's the wrong shape to live in. I'd rather like to live over there. It's sea. What's the sea doing over there? I know there's land there, but I'd rather live over there. No. you adjust to what there is. You adjust to the level of saving that happens to be with that population. It may be insufficient to have high growth, all right, so you have full employment with low growth. So much for Keynes. However, as David Ricardo said, men err in their productions. In other words, there's going to be many firms getting it wrong, and they're especially going to get it wrong when there has been a credit boom and a following bust. I shall close pretty rapidly, I think. Oh, I should say a quick thing about the macroeconomics. You wouldn't believe this unless you had to take the stuff. But there are these models dealing with economies where there's one commodity. One commodity. Obviously, they don't have commodity money then. Otherwise, there'd be nothing to buy but money. So they have money and they have one commodity and they have one way of making it and they have one type of worker. Equally, I don't know why they play these games. But in my view, macroeconomics ignores the big picture, paradoxically. They don't see the interconnecting nature of companies employing one another, making use of one another, competing with one another, or ignoring one another. That's what companies do. But the plans of companies can, and this is where I'm a bit radical, this is new, you heard it here first, folks. There is always coordination. Even if companies are going down the tubes, they're still, until they finally, but even that's part of a plan, until they finally go for insolvency and the bankruptcy court, they're following a plan. The whole point with private property and access to common things such as the public roads or whatever it might be, is that for the most part, you have rivals, but they don't actually stop you doing what you want. You have your plan, you're going to buy this, and perhaps you can, you expect it was at that price, and it pretty much was, and you're going to make this thing this way, and there's some delays and some things go easily, but you mostly end up getting the product that you intended into the shops, not costing about what you expected it. Okay, so you've got your plan, and your rivals cannot undermine your plan, except insofar as once you get your goods into the shops, you then find that your rivals' goods sell far more. But the way I look at that is by saying that the consumer, the purchaser, cannot be part of your plan. We don't own them. You cannot direct them to buy your produce. You can simply hire people, buy stuff, work up your product, price it, advertising, put it on display, and there goes the customer. So there is much that is predictable and much that is finally unpredictable, but you're all fully coordinated. I'm helped in this regard by reading the works of Leibniz, which is unusual in economics, and his idea of possible worlds theory. It's gone more generally into philosophy these days, but he had the idea of compossibility, things that fit together. And it so happens that even if you keep making a cock-up with your plan, or rather keep having to replace your plan, or to find other ways of getting through to your goal, which might be having a product in the shops at a certain date, at any point, things that happen were able to happen. I think that's not too bold a claim in the philosophy. Therefore, every plan, even if it has to be changed continually, whilst you're working according to a plan, a sub-plan, to walk down the street is to have a great many sub-plans. You dodge this, that you didn't anticipate, you slow down, you move into a gap, but you plan to be at the end of the street fairly within a certain time, and you manage to do it. All the bits involved unpredictable parts, predictable in kind, but unpredictable in particular. But as you get down the street, and people coming the other way get down the street, you've both followed your plans, and then an economy is like this. Anything that actually happens was not blocked because it happened. So you're not stymied in any way by the activities of other planners and other firms. So there is always, in one sense, coordination. You're all able to, you either directly enable each other, your supplier supplies you, that's one way, or he maintains a road that you make use of, or a railway line you make use of, or A non-rival does that. So that's also another kind of supplier. Even your rival can be of use to you because he tells you the better ways of doing things. So what's new here, and I'll close on this because it's mine own, is that there can be an analysis of market coordination such that there is never perfection, one sense of perfection. There are not perfect markets, there's not Pareto optimality. But there is a system that selects superior plans over inferior plans, and it is always possible to have people working hard, intelligently, earning a fair reward in such a system, which is always going to be superior to a socialist system, and is always going to be superior to a system of monetary intervention and stimulus by those who claim to be following Keynes. I thank you. Oh yeah.
Is there any questions?
Speaking of the best of all possible worlds, who was it made the wise crack? One of the English Hegelians. Famous names.
Keynes?
What did he say?
He said,
The Secret of Hegel.
yeah, the English Hegelians. Bradley.
Oh, Bradley. Oh, yes,
Bradley.
Bradley. Well, Keynes was not The Secret of Hegel.
Yeah, Bradley was talking about possible. He said, "Yes, this is the best of all possible worlds, and everything in it is a necessary evil."
Yes.
Which for a philosopher is funny, I might tell you.
Yeah, but it's roughly what Leibniz said. You know?
Yeah. Oh,
He
yes.
said, you think it's evil, but I'm telling you that it's a necessary evil, so it's the best we could have. So
Yes.
be happy. That's more or less what done. Of course, Candide, I think, was one long fallacious argument against Pangloss, but still very long. Is there any questions? Do you object to the explanation this is the best of all possible worlds?
Let's not sidetrack the economics.
Is it not only called evil by those who are weeded out in the process?
Hang on a bit. you can go later. Go first.
Keynes and
You can go.
Marx vindicated, no, but do you think the Austrian school has been vindicated?
It's become more noticeable. I mean, there are even those who complain about it, which is good.
But I mean, specifically, the Austrian theory of business holds that there's malinvestment in the capital goods sector. Did this recession start because of that? I mean, it happened in property and land speculation.
Well,
What does the Austrian theory say about that?
that's
From what I've always read, it's been textbook. It's malinvestment goes into capital goods.
well. The land is a capital good. It's not usually called that, but property and land is capital. And there certainly was an undeniable boom in that.
Capital goods, longer production runs.
Yeah, I dealt with this elsewhere, because it's no use to you. But what I do find a bit muddled in some Austrian analysis is there's a running together of two separate things, distinct things. One is that making something can take a time, like making a tree, or growing, obtaining cork from cork trees. That's a similar kind of thing, or wine, or there are certain production runs that take a time to get from ingredients to elements are very quick. And the things that have been confused is sometimes something which can be run up very quickly, like a building, or you've got a dance company or something, you can hire people in a week. But your business plan might be that initially you'll run a little loss, you may have to spend money on advertising, may have to become known, liked by the public, slowly build up a base. You see the point? So you can take longer. So it's not necessarily a mere physical thing, the time it takes to make something. I mean, other things being equal, the sooner you make something, the better. There's nothing good about taking time. This is love making, I suppose. And even then,
Slow cooking.
some of the things to do in life, apparently. Yes, so those two are run together. But you're during this crisis, or rather, what it's called the crisis, this period following the bust. Yes, the Austrians have got far more of a look in, which is good. I see nothing wrong in that, even if I don't buy the complete Rothbardian package. in explanation of a crisis. But certainly it's very good that they become noticed.
No, there's just an I mean, it's like the sort of slowest gazelle calling natural selection evil. You wouldn't call it evil if you rise to the top.
Well, we might not like that people have to go. I mean, some Catholic theologians have tried to say that a cancer or a gallstone, there's nothing wrong in it. It's something good in an inconvenient place. That's how they got round it. So everything that is good. It's not always
Mary Douglas has
where
said
it would be best to be, is it?
Mary Douglas said that dirt is matter in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Jan? Sorry.
One of the reasons I stopped being a Marxist, or the main reason I stopped being a Marxist, was I realised that the explanations, how things are supposed to work, just didn't really make any sense at all. It's not so much that they were empirically false, but the explanations just didn't hold together. And I always felt the same about Keynesian economics. Just how can this make any sense? Just because you consider it in microeconomic terms is nonsense. You slap on a few macroeconomic labels, how does that change anything? I don't understand how anybody can think that this could work. It's completely irrelevant to talk about empirical refutations. So the problem then becomes, how do we convince people that these explanations just don't, they're non-starters? Well, we need better people. And the way we get better people is we teach people philosophy in schools, in particular logic and argument and epistemology, and then they can just see through this stuff as nonsense. Because at the moment we've got apparently intelligent people who just, and you just think, what is wrong with this person that he can't see that this is just codswallop?
Well, there's two answers. The simple-minded Keynesian has always been with us, which is that people aren't spending enough, they're not consuming enough. If they did that, it would set the wheels of industry turning, blah, blah, blah. There's that one. That's always been with us. The more sophisticated came after Keynes. Well, may have been there before him, but he boosted this view about aggregate demand. But then what made it easier to swallow was that they were almost not dealing with the world as they, in other days of the week, they were seeing it actually was. So along with this idea of single commodity and a single worker, or whatever it might be, a single type of worker, was the idea that you could simply look at the nominal value of demand. Has that gone up? Has that gone down? So they're almost obliged to come out of the world and think that there's one thing, supply, here it is, and one thing, demand. And is the demand enough to pick up the supply, as it were? Will it fit with it? And the full silliness of this came to me. See, these very intelligent men, more intelligent than I am, because they've had their university education, because that's their world system, their model, they almost stopped thinking, except with the equipment they've been given, with the bits and pieces they've been given. So if demand falls, that's money being spent, and there's stuff for sale, well, that's just stuff with a price label, aggregated up. And if you can have spending equal to the previous level of spending, then you'll have the previous level of employment. Well, no, because the people who are unemployed maybe in one city, and they're woodworkers, and the money is being spent on something else somewhere else. The idea, simply because it's the same amount of money, that you have the same employment. Now, you may get to the same amount of employment through people moving, taking pay cuts, learning new trades, whatever it might be, but that would have happened anyway. It didn't require the deficit finance or the borrowing or the printing of money to do that. The adjustment was always possible. Government is there to stop the adjustments, or make them more necessary, sadly, and then, in another sense, make them unnecessary because you're relieved of the burden of not having adjusted. It's unenviable in some ways, but that's what they do. So that's why intelligent men can almost... I remember being stunned when I finally tumbled to this. In a sense, I should have known, because they had sort of the blob theory, or some have dismissed it. It's a blob of capital, the blob of demand, or a blob of supply, and if they're the right size, well, it's like two drunks leaning against each other, or, you know, if they're just like, it fits, that's the macro picture. Whereas if it's thousands of different trades and things, some increasing, taking on, some declining, then you've got to move, shift, do all sorts of things, write things off, change the lands, build houses there, knock them down here. And yet that's all out of the picture somehow. It's just, you just have to spend enough and you'll employ everybody again. So I remember being stunned. You know, I thought, it can't be as simple as that. They can't be thinking just the amount of money being spent will do the trick. Well, more, preferably, of course, and politicians like to be told that they ought to be spending more. Oh, I should point out that Keynes always thought, well, at times, part of the Keynesian remedy, or rather set practice that should be carried through time, is that in good times, you save some of the tax money, put it in the big box, and then come the downturn, you open the lid of the box, take it, and spend it on necessary, useful things to do. No, actually you don't. You put nothing in the box, and come the downturn, you print more of the stuff and pose for photo opportunities outside new projects or grateful workers or something. That's all it's come to, sadly.
Even if you don't agree that the money printing, easy credit, easy money policy isn't a good way for us to grow our way out of the current problems, would you concede that the money printing, etc., is a good way for the state to make its debts disappear, short of completely defaulting? And if not, what would you suggest they do to get out of the current mess, which is basically about debt?
It's a way of defaulting, of course. So they'll do both. They'll default on promises to pensioners and the sick, and so the taxes will go up, services will decline in quality. That's one way they're going to do it. I haven't touched upon it, but the big banks, who are of course part of the problem here, on other occasions I've called out against, as I call it, fiat credit, production of money that isn't even paper money. It can't even rise to that honourable position of being real paper. In fact, I mean, Somalia actually reached a stage where they had a paper standard. It was exactly worth, well, it was worth slightly less because it had sport with ink. But the point is that the amount of paper you had was worth about as much as it cost. So they couldn't then go below that. What they did to make it work, they had to not put ever larger denomination notes. Then you just the same people, you know. So we had to pick bundles of the stuff, had to be carried around. And that eventually stabilised inflation because it just couldn't. It was too expensive to inflate. The government wasn't making any money from printing more money because it cost more. It cost as much to get the paper in. Anyway, but yes, the governments will one way or the other default. It's true. They default on their promises to the people, and to the borrowers, those who have lent the money, they will give them depreciated currency back with the same nominal payment. What they owe, they will pay, but they'll pay in depreciated currency. I haven't said what should have been done with the banks. Well, don't treat them that way to start with. You know, okay, let's say that we can't do anything about that. We have the crisis. What should have been done was, I wouldn't have done it because that against my principles. But someone less principled should have done this, as in Sweden, nationalise the banks immediately. Just take them into prison. The investors get zip. The shareholders get nothing. They should have looked out. They should have looked out for their interests. Top management removed. No bonuses, no nothing, clear off. Recapitalise and then put them back into the market some years later. That would have been better.
Or just let them collapse and just refund people's savings.
Yeah, well, they had a guarantee up to, it was 33,000, then it went up to 50,000 or something.
It's about 80,000 now.
Now it is, yeah. I mean, given all the other things that are done by governments, you can almost excuse them doing something non-libertarian in the event of a crisis, because they've so skewed everything else that it might be instant libertarianism would not be the best thing, especially if it leads to libertarians being chased down the street and attacked for being vicious swine and put us in this position.
That man in the picture, he started this.
Big facts. Yeah, but certainly there was no real crisis. Never is a real crisis. The true danger is what governments will do in response to a supposed crisis. More power, more attack, all this. That's the real problem. Compared to, say, the Japanese tsunami or an earthquake or a famine or an epidemic, those are true problems. Labour is lost, that's human capital is lost, or other capital is lost. This means that incomes have to be lower, therefore we have to adjust, and certain things have to be given up, and people with marginal incomes may fall by the wayside or have to be taken care of. So that's a true crisis. So it's sort of would have been unreal on all of this, because it's, as others, quite a few have pointed out, usually of the Austrian school, but not necessarily, but certainly the laissez-faire analysis, is that all that happens is the banks default, this happens there, that's defaulted on, that's defaulted on, that's defaulted on. Prices do fall down, but they fall down. They're still coordinating at every level. You can still, as I've said, turn out the stuff. And that's the real income, that's the real wealth. But you simply have different owners now. Some people who have been taught no end of a lesson, they borrow too much, they speculated too much, whatever they did, but there are people now owning. There'll be new banks, or there'll be banks with new names, or there'll be banks with new managements. And insofar as you need an intermediary between a saver and a borrower, banks have a role. No, they're not vital. I mean, the important thing is to produce stuff. That's true prosperity and demand, and the banks are part of that. But along with investment, buying bonds, buying shares, being a partner, having your own company, having a family firm, there are all sorts of ways of capitalising. So banks are not that important. We could have let the banking system collapse. I mean, to a libertarian, what is the banking system? Well, it's people's money and what they do with it. Is that difficult to understand? Doesn't sound important enough somehow, does it? But it is. That's simply what it would be. People's money and what they do with it. Mostly they just buy stuff, but also they make stuff. But the idea that finances everything. That's still the modern view, that somehow finance. They don't like saving, but they like finance. Now, can you make sense of that? There has to be saving for there to be. You would have thought. Now, there can be forced saving by just printing the stuff and allowing those with fixed incomes to make do with less and less, which does happen, of course. But even then, that's still saving, though it's not honest saving. It's a kind of taking. It's a diluting of them. I mean, Harry Lime, in The Third Man, you may recall, was regarded as a murderer because he diluted penicillin. In those days, it was in liquid form to be injected. And young children died because they were given too low a dose. And the government does that with your money, or its money, perhaps I should say. So we get monetary dilution and deaths as a consequence.
Yes. How to explain financial crisis to an average Joe who, at every attempt to explain things about regulations and how can we make less of them and so on, will say, but those neoliberals like Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan and so on were in power for during the 1980s, and what do we have now? Now we have the financial crisis. So it must be completely entirely their fault.
Only
explain to an average Joe.
Only if they were the creators of Gordon Brown and Blair, which in a way they were, but mostly they were not. Both of them spoke free market. They didn't do it. They did it a bit. Funnily enough, it was who was in the Oval Office with the secretary on her knees? That fellow, of course. That fellow. Well, because
He was a card.
yeah, because the House was one way and the Senate was one way and the President was the other. He doesn't deserve much praise for this. He actually got the deficit down the tax take, still ridiculous, but was lower than it was otherwise have been. So he looks a good guy, but then he didn't speak the rhetoric. And Mrs. Thatcher was good for that. She appeared to be an appalling Manchester liberal. She thinks everything should be for sale, unless it's charity. And of course, in a sense, she didn't, but she looked like she did, and so she was useful for propaganda purposes. Except she was a hating bitch, apparently, which we're allowed to say of people who are Tories. But to the average Joe, well, you have to have a story, a fairly straightforward story, that kind of hangs together. You have to appear decent people and sane, and so even if in small numbers, in an extremity, a crisis even, they may turn to such people. Of course, they also may turn to a man, a military leader with a white horse. I mean, that's sadly another way people jump when there's difficult times. But if people have an explanation of why it happened, how it had to happen, I mean, I wasn't alone in thinking, well, this can't end well. I didn't surprise it would quite wipe out all the banks if they weren't artificially supported, but I didn't know they were taking a punt at 33-1 on an impossible event that turned up really rapidly. I didn't see that, but certainly I realised that there was going to be a bust to this boom, and I think the average Joe can understand that.
Why should we worry about what the average Joe thinks?
Good point. We have to worry about what the average journalist thinks.
Maybe.
Yeah.
People who have influence. Or power, which is even worse.
Yeah, they work with the ideas of defunct economists. Defunct only means dead, isn't it? Or does it mean uninfluential?
Something you take the funk down.
Something that's no longer operative, I think.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that is the famous remark of Maynard Keynes.
Yes, that's right.
Men in office.
He was never a funked economist, was he? In fact, I think he was. I mean, I think it's pretty clear if you read his book. He was an anti-economist. He hated economists, didn't he? But what he did dislike is what you dislike as well. He disliked the equilibrium, didn't he? Absolutely hated the equilibrium.
Yes, he had to bring it in at times.
Well, he had to bring it in because it was so popular. He hated it. But the chap at the LSE loved the equilibrium and gave the Keynesian account with equilibrium in his heart, which was not Keynesian. So in the textbooks they would plead the chap at the LSE.
ISLM.
Yes, what's his name?
Robbins. No, Robbins, the other one.
The younger boy. He was keen on mathematical economics.
We should remember this.
Yeah, he published the Hayek story in 1967, Attack on the Museum Trade Cycle.
Yeah.
What's his name? He's probably the economist of the 20th century, actually, ahead of Keynes. Hicks, that's it, John Hicks.
Of course, John Hicks. Yes. Though he claimed to be something of an Austrian towards the end.
Oh, well, he's very interested in Austrians all along. He wrote about 3 or 4 books on Austrian economics. Yeah, John Hicks, yeah. The Austrian theory of capital, and so on. Is there any other questions? John?
To what extent did Keynes really believe his own theories rather than he thought? This is a way of manipulating things I can improve. I don't really understand it myself, but I sort of have an intuition, so I'll split this way and convince people. Because there is evidence that he said on one occasion, well, you know, if that happens, I'll just come up with a new book and nudge things in the other direction.
Yeah.
Which indicated that there was no real belief in a sound theoretical system.
He probably thought he could sell almost anything. Certainly, the circumstances, people were desperate for a way out. But I think he also thought that he was a sort of Einstein of economics. That there was a kind of Copernican shift, and he'd seen something that had been missed, and this was how, because of animal spirits. It's not just that, but the investors, those who are producing assets to be used as capital goods, will.
It was the witch doctor economics.
Well, so there's something in it, but the reason that animal spirits get dimmed is that they ought to be. What happens is that people become disheartened when they ought to be disheartened. In other words, it's after the bubble was about to burst or is bursting, then they get disheartened. But then, in a sense, it's like when the ship's sinking, you ought to worry about getting drowned because there's every likelihood of it. And so, what Keynes did, he thought he'd explained the break, the crisis, the turn, the downturn. No. He'd simply said, look, we get this in the second and third stages of recession. Well, no one knew that. Once people aren't earning, then they aren't going to be spending. If they're not spending, then people can't. There's not demand. There's not the product. They're not earning. They're not earning because they're not making. Because they're not making, there's no product to exchange for money and use the money to exchange for another product. So that's the real reason the demand falls, because output is falling. It seems a bit weird to say that the answer to unemployment is to start working, but that's the answer. But not there, at that rate, making that thing. That was wrong, that was skewed, there was too much of that. Capital and labour has to go and do something else.
Well, the answer to unemployment is to stop people paying pain to not work.
Yeah.
That's right, but I think his Copernican revolution was holding, and this is where he said the general theory. He had the idea that a market clearing in equilibrium, that's a special case.
Yes.
The general theory is that there's no equilibrium.
Well, then he had to
against equilibrium. There's no equilibrium. Equilibrium is a myth. You need the government to stimulate the economy to bring supply and demand together. Of course, this is conspicuously false, but this is what the government like to hear.
Well, also, he had to explain why there was full employment at all. He thought there would always be sort of quasi-depression. So there was never as much activity as there could be because the interest rates were too high. But everyone was working. Where are these things they could have been doing better? Obviously, there's more saving, there are more new ways can be tried, new inventions to be put into practice. I think. But he didn't much care for saving. But he thought there should be. Well, he also thought if you goose the money supply, you can lower interest rates. That's another. I didn't touch on that. He thought you could permanently make them lower, and that's not permanent. It can be done in the short run, but after a while, rather like wages have to keep up with inflation, interest rates have to keep up with inflation. And I didn't touch upon this because it's a big subject, but usually, especially when there's a pegged currency, the break comes, the popping of the bubble comes, when the country's currency is under threat. It's always under threat. But the point is, it's becoming embarrassing. It's going to have to be devalued against some other currency which is less soft, more hard, or not as soft as the currency in question. So, to protect the exchange rate, interest rates are put up. At that point, that sharp thing pop, with a rapidly increasing pace. Then the thing starts to unravel.
That makes you mind. Is it popping or unraveling?
Well, it could be a knitted balloon, which will be a bit leaky, you would have thought.
He doesn't mind the mixed metaphors, as long as the reality is stable. Any more questions?
Sorry. In regards to stimulus packages, the only thing I would look at to see that there was evidence of a stimulus package working, and I just want to get your opinion on this. I mean,
sure.
During the 50s, Harold Macmillan, he apparently used the Keynesian stimulus package. And this was at the time, it became one of an intense growth period for the UK. What was the genuine reason if it wasn't the stimulus package?
Some have thought that may be one of the few cases where it did cut wages below what they would have been. But because it was a period of growth, the workers were getting more anyway in real income. Some savers they're not doing as well as they might, but they were doing okay. Piled up savings were being a bit eroded by this, but they were historically quite good, so people weren't fussed. So there almost was a case of, some have said, not sure I agree, where people were priced into work. In fact, Dave and myself always do a double act at this point. Back in the 50s and 60s, and most of human history, I should say, where there's money in a market, people have always been wanted. Farmers are always saying, can't get any labour, can't get it, love no money.
You walk down the streets and every shop has more workers, more assistance required.
Apply within.
And I was working on a building site, and people used to regularly swear at the boss, and the boss used to sack him. Said, okay, and so they sack him and then just go up the road and get another job.
So that was the case then, but was that the case then because there wasn't a minimum wage, it was easier to fire people, easier to hire people? I think it was more like that. So that was more like normal times. Though it may have actually helped, I can't deny it, that a loose money approach may have actually slightly helped until it led to troubles with the pound and the jamming up of interest rates and stop go and all that. Sorry.
There's also the crisis of the 70s. You can say the 50s, 60s were a bubble for a part, and the 70s we paid the price, which was burst.
Yeah, it can take time. Yeah.
Well, I think I don't think that we're looking at full employment isn't particularly a boom. I mean, a boom, according to Mises, is the inflationary boom. You inflate and spend false money or the bogus money, and that creates a boom. It distorts the economy. But what Bob and me was just saying there is that the normal, we're saying the opposite of Keynes, in fact. The normal is, don't particularly want to use the word equilibrium, but the normal is a cleared market and a shortage of labour. There is a perennial shortage of labour. I think the UK economy could easily employ every other worker in the world at the right wages. And indeed, if it opened the borders, it would get quite a lot of immigration from India at the wages that those people find. In fact, what it has had from about 1950 is illegal immigration from India, not being able to get open employment on the market because they're illegal immigrants, getting jobs on the black market. And we know that there's no end to the people that can come from India. Well, there is an end, but it's a hell of a lot of people in India in comparison with England. And they could all come in, and if there was no immigration controls, they probably would all come in, and they'd all find jobs on the simply because there is a shortage of labour, and they find jobs in the retail industry and so on, in the things that Indian restaurants and so on, the things that the Indians do. They set up their own jobs and set up their own wage rates and so on, and there is just no limit. And now a book that I think that verifies this completely and utterly is The Ultimate Resource by Julian Simon.
Verifies?
Verifies, yes, okay, verifies. I'm not saying that it proves it. I'm not saying it justifies it. I'm saying it verifies it.
Worse, verifies.
Well, is verification worse than
This
justification?
is Popperian in talking.
I verify. I'm holding a glass in my hand. I think justification's a myth, right? I agree on that.
At this point, further philosophy should take place.
At this point, I think is there any other questions on the talk? No? Well, we can continue this. I'll buy you a pint and we'll continue this over a drink. Thank you very much indeed.